Now we're going to focus on the lymphatic system, which is commonly referred to as the immune system. Now the lymphatic system is a little larger in scope than just the immune system. And we're going to focus how the lymphatic system is not just dealing with white blood cells, but also dealing with different organs and tissues that actually filter, drain different fluids, and protect the body. Now the lymphatic system is a slow circulation process directed by a network of vein-like vessels. And the reason why they're vein-like vessels is primarily because of the layers and the valves that it does have. Now the fluid is commonly called lymph, hence lymphatic system. The fluid is a clear fluid, and this fluid resides between the tissues. Now there is no pump. As we know, the heart is the pump of the circulatory system, or what pushes the lymph through the lymphatic vessels is the skeletal muscle and the blood vessels around the lymph vessels. Now the lymphatic system, as we're going to learn in the next lecture, does produce immune cells, and these different immune cells, specifically found in the blood, the white blood cells, we're going to be talking about specific types later. As we hinted to, the lymphatic system consists of lymph and the vessels that carry the lymph. It also consists of lymphatic organs and tissues. These tissues, remember, cells form tissues, tissues form organs. The specific organs are going to include the thymus and the spleen. And then we're going to be dealing with different tissues such as lymph nodes, nodules, and the red bone marrow. Then we're going to be focusing on and ending with the lymphatic cells, and we'll segue from this lecture to the next lecture, dealing with lymphatic cells. Now, again, the function is to drain excess interstitial fluid or the fluid between the cells, to drain it from the capillaries and send it throughout the body and back to the bloodstream. It's also going to absorb lipids or fats from the blood, specifically from the intestines, and these lymphatic vessels are called lacteals. And the reason why they're called lacteals is because of the chyle, which is a milky lipid-containing form of lymph. Now, lymph is primarily going to be clear, but this lymph now, because of the lipid content, is more of a milky color, hence the word lactate or lacteal. The function of the lymphatic system, of course, is to carry out immune responses and protect the body from any allergens or viruses or bacteria that may be attacking the body. Here you can see the capillaries in the center picture and the lymph vessels around those capillaries as the tissue fluid or interstitial fluid drains from the capillaries. It's then picked up by the lymph vessels, and you can see the lymph vessels on the right hand side here. You can see the endothelial cells, and they are anchored by connective tissue. On the sides you have these little valves. Here again, what we've already talked about, showing you the capillary view. Now the lymphatic vessels can be described or identified as rain gutters. The rain gutters will collect water from around the roof of the house and then send it out. That's very similar to the lymphatic vessels. They drain this excess interstitial fluid and then basically send it out. Now the lymph fluid, as we said before, is clear and colorless, and this fluid is drained from around the cells, and this resides in the spaces around the cells, and then basically it will be then filtered, and it's considered a filtered form of plasma. So very similar in the content of plasma, the protein material. As this material leaks out of the cells and out of the capillary walls, it then will enter the lymphatic system, lymphatic vessels. As we said, the blood vessels have blood, lymphatic vessels have lymph, but the problem with the two, or the difference between the two, is that the blood has, specifically the circulatory system, has a heart to pump it. The lymph doesn't. or the lymphatic vessels don't, but they rely on the pumping or the movement of the blood vessels around the lymph vessels and skeletal muscle to help squeeze it. And again, the lymphatic system is going to transport foreign particles to the lymph nodes to filter and to help break down the foreign particle. Now, at the very end, lymph is going to rejoin the blood, so it's filtered out of the blood, out of the cells, out of the capillaries, and then it's gone through this filter system, and then it will then be added back to the blood. And this is specifically going to happen at the right and left subclavian veins, and this is in the location of the neck and upper arms. So as you can see here, you have the basic breakdown and movement or transport of the lymph, and this is going to start with the capillaries. And so we have the interstitial fluid. The lymph is leading the capillaries. It then enters the small lymph vessels, moved to a lymph node, lymphatic vessel. Then you have the larger structure, or the larger vessels, called the lymphatic trunks. And then this is going to be then collected in the collecting duct and then moved to the subclavian veins, okay, at the top of the vena cava, or superior vena cava. So again, the lymph vessels are going to be a three-layered vessel, and those three layers, as you can see at the bottom, is called the tunica interna, the internal part, the most internal layer. Then you have the media, which is the middle layer, and then you have the externa, which is the thin outer layer. So very similar to veins. So veins also have those three layers, but the lymph vessel is still thinner than the vein. The lymph vessel does have valves, just like the vein, but the lymph vessel has more valves than the vein, more numerous valves. And of course, the lymph vessel carries lymph, while the blood vessel carries blood. And at different intervals of the lymph vessel, as the lymph moves down, they'll get to little pit stops or little train stations, which will be the lymph nodes at different intervals along the lymph vessel. And basically there are superficial sets, so closer to the skin, closer to the outside of the body, and then you have deeper sets of lymph vessels which are more internal. And as we said, there are valvi flaps to prevent backflow. So it's only a one direction of lymph flow. So near the right subclavian vein, you have the right lymphatic duct. This is going to be a short duct that's going to drain the lymph from the right side of the body above the ribs and right upper arm. So it's only going to be that quarter of the body, while the thoracic duct, or the left lymphatic duct, is going to be dealing with the other 3/4, the left side of the body, and this is going to be draining lymph from the entire left half of the body and the right lower half, including below the ribs and the right lower limb. Now, each of these ducts are going to open into a junction of the subclavian and internal jugular veins. The jugular veins are also in the neck, near the carotid arteries. Now let's talk about the organs. There's two different separations here. You have the primary lymphatic organs and the secondary lymphatic organs. The primary lymphatic organs are going to be focusing on the thymus and the red bone marrow. And basically, this is where you're going to have B lymphocytes, or B cells, and T cells are going to be formed and matured in this area. Then we have the secondary lymphatic organs, which include the spleen and different tissues such as the lymph nodes and lymphatic nodules. This is where you're going to have more immune response, as well as the maturing of the lymphocytes, so they can actually perform their function. So let's talk about the thymus. The thymus is a bilobed referring to two lobes. So this is a soft, uneven, asymmetrical bilobed organ located below the throat area. This is going to be anterior to the aorta of the heart, and it is in this chest region behind the sternum. It is larger and it does peak in childhood, so when the baby is in the womb developing and as the baby is an infant, it's going to be larger than what it is in an adult. The thymus will produce hormones like thymosin. The primary function is to stimulate the production of T cells. Now the T cells, as you can see at the bottom here, basically are formed to provide immunity. So as you can see the structure and shape of the thymus, you can see there is a outer portion, you can see the development of the T cells. There's some other cells that we're going to be talking about in the future, the dendritic cells, the macrophages. Now remember, the red bone marrow is the site of the formation of blood elements such as red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, specifically your red blood cells. And inside the red bone marrow, you have the B and T cells being formed. Now the T cells are going to mature more in the thymus, as we just talked about on the previous slides. The red bone marrow, remember, is on the ends, or the spongy bone, the epiphysis of the long bone. Now let's focus on the lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are small bean-shaped or round, oval-shaped capsules, and these capsules are covered in connective tissue. And they're about 1 to 25 millimeters long, and these are going to be scattered throughout the lymphatic system as little pit stops along the vessels. Now these nodes are usually found in clusters or groups, so there's usually not just one or two. Usually there's going to be a grouping of maybe 2, 3, or 4. And the lymph nodes are primarily going to act as a filter. And this filter could be used to collect bacteria, dead white blood cells. This also does include cancer cells. But the lymph nodes really don't have a detoxification function, meaning they don't detoxify or break down any toxins. Now, the defense cells within the lymph node will include macrophages and lymphocytes. Macrophages are going to engulf and destroy, so these are larger cells that are going to break down. The term or the prefix macro meaning large, phage referring to break down or engulf. So this will destroy any foreign particles. The lymphocytes are specifically the immune response cells to any specific allergens or antigens of the body, any foreign invaders. Now we do have two types of lymph vessels. We have the afferent and efferent. We have the afferent and efferent lymph vessels, starting with the letter A. This is where it's going to be coming in. It's going to start. It's entering the lymph vessel or coming towards the lymph node. It's entering the lymph node or coming towards the lymph node, while the efferent lymph vessel is going to leave the lymph node. Now I'm going to show you a picture. I'm going to have you draw a picture of the lymph node, and what you can see here in this picture, you can see the afferent vessels coming into the lymph node, and then you see the efferent leaving the lymph node. And this is in this little hilus or hilum area, kind of like what you learn in biology with the bean. That little belly button or seed scar is called the hilum. In the same way, we're calling this little concave indentation of the lymph node where the efferent lymph vessels leave we call that the hilum or hilus. Now, as you look at the internal parts of the lymph node, you can actually see these little separations. Now, the trabecula or trabeculae, these are going to be a dividing section. This is going to be connective tissue that's going to divide the node into different compartments. And then when we have spaces in those compartments, those are going to be called sinuses. Now there is an outer cortex, which is an outer layer. Now the overall outer layer of the whole lymph node is called the capsule. But the cortex is going to be more of the outer layer of these sinuses. Now the outer cortex is going to form B cells, and we'll talk about what B cells do in the future. And then we have the inner cortex, which is going to form T cells. Now, deep within the cortex, you have the middle or inner part, which is called the medulla. Now, these contain B cells, plasma cells, and macrophages. So we have a lot of different immune cells that will not just break down, but also fight against different foreign invaders. And between the lymphatic tissue in the cortex, in the medulla, are again more of those spaces, specifically the cortical sinuses and the medullary sinuses. Now we do have a whole bunch of lymph nodes around the large intestine and small intestine. You can actually see here the lymph nodes around the appendix, and we'll talk about the appendix. As you can see, the appendix is coming off of the cecum of the large intestine. So when the small intestine interacts with the large intestine, you have that larger bulge called the cecum, and you have the appendix coming down. The appendix does work with the immune system. Now let's talk about the spleen. The spleen is the oval soft organ located in the left hypochondriac region. You learned this at the beginning of the year about the different regions. So this is on the left side. It is the largest lymphatic organ of the body in the adult. It's located between ribs 9 through 11. And it's also going to come in contact with the pancreas, kidney, and large intestine, as well as the stomach. Very similar to the kidney, it's going to filter blood, and it acts as a reservoir or storage. Reservoir refers to storage of red blood cells. It will also break down and destroy any worn out blood cells, red blood cells that might not be functional. And it does form blood cells for the developing baby. Now it's going to be divided into two different types of tissue based on color. We are going to see red pulp and white pulp in the structure of the spleen. Now, there's two specific tissues. We have the stroma, which is a supportive tissue that's going to make the capsule, the trabeculae, the reticular fibers, and the fibroblasts. Now, we'll learn about fibroblasts. We'll learn about fibroblasts later. We will learn about the fibroblasts later. But then you have the parenchyma. Now, the parenchyma is the tissue that's going to have that white and red pulp. Now, you may recognize stroma and parenchyma when we talked about the chloroplast. Very similar in the structure and the pattern. We're going to kind of reuse some of these names in different branches of science. But here we're talking about the tissue making up the spleen. And the white pulp is going to be more of a lymphatic tissue consisting of lymphocytes or lymph cells and macrophages, the larger cell that breaks down antigens or foreign bodies. And basically the white pulp is going to surround branches of the artery, okay, that is in the spleen. Now this artery is going to supply the spleen with blood, as it enters the hilum of the spleen. Again, we're using the word hilum, that little indentation where the blood vessels enter the organ. The red pulp, however, is going to be filled with venous sinuses. And these actually will contain red blood cells, macrophages, lymphocytes, and plasma cells. And the macrophages remove ruptured and worn out blood cells. In the red pulp, you're going to have macrophages removing damaged or ruptured red blood cells. You're going to have a storage of platelets, as well as you're going to have a production of, again, red blood cells during the fetal life of the baby. Now let's talk about different lymphatic tissues. There's some overlap in some of these tissues, but we're going to first focusing on lymphatic nodules. They're not as big as the lymph nodes, but these congregation of cells, remember cells form tissues, tissues form organs, but basically we have these masses of cells, this tissue that's going to basically cause an aggregation of the lymphocytes. Now, aggregation is referring to formation, so it's going to form the lymphocytes. That a lymph nodule is different from a lymph node primarily because of the size. The lymph node is larger, the lymph nodule is much smaller, and basically the lymph nodule does not have connective tissue covering the whole structure. A lymph node will. So a lymph node will have a capsule or a connective tissue covering. A lymph nodule will not have that covering. Now, most of the lymphatic nodules are smaller and they're more solitary. As we said, the lymph nodes are more in groups. The lymph nodules are more solitary and scattered. Now, on the right-hand side, you can actually see a picture of the lymphatic nodule. This is a grouping of the lymphatic tissue. And there are different types of lymphatic nodules that do group together to form a larger structure. As we said, tonsils. We have the Peyer's patches, which is a type of MALT or mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. So again, tonsils, Peyer patches, the appendix is a lymphatic tissue. So we have cells forming this tissue before it's considered or identified as an organ. But these specific tissues, why we call it MALT, is because of the mucus lining. Okay, so the mucus that's given off of this lymphatic tissue. So let's talk about the MALT, this mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. This is going to primarily protect the digestive and respiratory systems. It's going to be located in those areas. It's going to have more of a mucous membrane. And there's not really going to be connective tissue surrounding this tissue. So you're not going to have the connective tissue that surrounds the lymph node. Again, the MALT includes Peyer patches, tonsils, the appendix, and we did say specifically in the respiratory and digestive systems. Now let's focusing on the tonsils. The tonsils, to many resources, are considered lymph nodes. Other resources identify them as lymphatic tissues that are separate from the lymph nodes. And one of the reasons why some resources don't consider them lymph nodes, even though they're pretty much the same size or very similar, they are not completely covered in the connective tissue. So there are partially visible sections of the lymph node. So the tonsil is kind of in this flux or in between. Is it a lymph node? Is it not? Most resources say yes, but these are primarily in the pharynx region. There are 3 different tonsils that we did see before when we learned about the tongue. And each tonsil is covered by an epithelium or soft tissue lining. They do have deep pits called crypts, which are lined by the different lymphatic nodules, and these function to trap bacteria and remove bacteria. Now we have the pharyngeal tonsils. Remember, pharyngeal referring to pharynx. So this is a single tonsil on the wall of the pharynx. You have your palatine tonsils, which are going to be 2 of them on either side of the oral cavity. So they are a pair. So when you open up your mouth, you're going to see one on the left, one on the right. You're going to see the uvula or the hanging ball structure in the middle of the 2 palatine tonsils. Think of palate is the roof of the mouth. And if you ever heard of tonsillitis, this is the infection mainly by bacteria of those 2 tonsils. Then you have the lingual tonsil. Remember, lingual, think of language. This is at the root or posterior of the tongue. So on this diagram, you can see the lingual and palatine tonsils. You see the swollen lymph nodes, the swollen tonsils, okay, versus the healthy tonsils. Now let's talk about the Peyer's patches. This is a collection of larger lymphatic tissue. Again, it's not covered by a capsule, so it's not really considered a lymph node. But basically, it's very similar in the shape, in which it's somewhat egg or oval shaped. It's going to be a larger connective tissue, but it's not covered by this connective tissue capsule. It's primarily going to be in the gastrointestinal tract, which is specifically the small intestine. It can be found in the urinary, reproductive, and respiratory tracts, but it's most commonly known for being in the small intestine. Now, many of these Peyer patches are small and solitary, kind of like the lymph nodules, and these are going to capture and destroy bacteria in the intestine. Now let's end with the lymphatic cells, also known as lymphoid cells. And these lymphatic cells primarily are going to be identified as macrophages, epithelial cells, dendritic cells, and lymphocytes. And we'll get into the specific type of lymphocytes and white blood cells later on in the next unit, in the next lecture. But let's focus on these 4 types, which will elicit an immune response and protect our body. The macrophages are going to engulf and digest a foreign invader, an antigen, and then present them to the T cells for recognition. The epithelial cells, think of epithelium. Basically, this is going to be the first type of cells to come in contact with an antigen or external stimuli. So think about the skin cells, think about the outside lining of the throat. These epithelial cells are going to react to chemicals and different particulates, different materials that are taken in the body. Then we have the dendritic cells, which are antigen-presenting cells. Basically, these dendritic cells have these little branching arms, look very similar to the dendrite of a nerve cell, but it is not a nerve cell. These antigen-fighting material and present it to the T cells again. Then we have the lymphocytes, which are going to be a form of a leukocyte or white blood cell. And these are round with a nucleus.